the end of Blackwood Pines. Sanitarium came not with a bang, but with a whisper of displaced air, a sigh of disturbed dust that had lain dormant for 40 years. On a grim, overcast morning in October 2019, a demolition crew tasked with clearing a forgotten plot of land on the outskirts of Oak Haven felt their excavators strike something unyielding. It wasn't rock. It was a concrete lintel, the top of a doorway buried beneath a decade's worth of soil and wild overgrowth. They had been told the land was empty, a failed development from the 70s. But as they cleared the earth, a building began to emerge, a low-slung brick structure that seemed to exhale a cold, stale breath into the autumn air. The local archives were consulted, old maps unfurled, and a name was resurrected from the town's collective amnesia: Blackwood Pines, a private nursing home that had, according to a single, baffling police report from 1979, ceased to exist overnight. Detective Eva Rostova felt the case file before she saw it. It landed on her desk with a thud that was heavier than its slender profile suggested, a weight composed of mystery and time. At 58, with eyes that held the tired wisdom of 1,000 tragedies, Eva was the precinct's reluctant historian, the keeper of its coldest, most stubborn cases. The Blackwood Pines file was legendary, a piece of local folklore told to scare rookies. 57 residents and 12 staff members vanished. The building itself, sealed and supposedly abandoned, had somehow slipped from city records, swallowed by bureaucratic oversight and the relentless green of the surrounding forest until today. Her younger partner, Detective Ben Carter, stood by her desk, his face a mixture of boyish excitement and professional apprehension. He saw a career-making case. Eva saw a ghost, a story that had haunted the fringes of her own childhood in this very town. She remembered the hushed whispers, the parents who pulled their children a little closer, the pervading sense of a question that had been left to fester, unanswered. The drive to the site was silent. The resurrected sanitarium sat in a clearing carved out by the demolition machines, looking like a wound in the earth. The brickwork was stained with moisture, and the windows were dark, vacant eyes, staring out at a world that had moved on without it. The air itself felt different here, heavy and still, thick with the scent of damp soil, rotting leaves, and something else, something faintly medicinal and cloyingly sweet, like forgotten perfume on decaying fabric. Eva buttoned her coat, the chill seeping deeper than the autumn cold. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a tomb, but a tomb without bodies. They stepped across the threshold, their flashlights cutting sharp, dancing cones through the gloom. The interior was a perfect, horrifying diorama of interrupted life. Dust lay like a fine gray shroud over everything, a delicate layer that had settled undisturbed for 4 decades. In the main recreational room, a game of checkers sat half-played on a table, the wooden pieces waiting for a move that would never come. A pair of glasses rested beside an open book, its pages yellowed and brittle. A row of wheelchairs sat angled towards a silent black-screen television, their wheels pointed in slightly different directions as if their occupants had all stood up in unison and simply walked away. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. There was only a profound and unnerving stillness, a silence that seemed to press in on them from all sides. Ben murmured something about it being like the Mary Celeste, but Eva didn't respond. She was tracing the outline of a handprint in the dust on a windowsill, a print far too small to belong to an adult. She moved through the building with a slow, deliberate methodology that masked the tremor in her hands. She had read the file, memorized the names, but seeing this place made it corporeal. This was where Eleanor Vance, a retired librarian, had been reading her poetry. This was where Arthur Macmillan, a veteran of the Second Great War, had told his endless stories to anyone who would listen. Her flashlight beam swept across a calendar on the wall, its pages still turned to October 1979. A single date was circled in red ink: the 31st, Halloween. A wave of unease washed over her, cold and sharp. The official report stated the discovery was made on the morning of November 1st. They had vanished on the night of All Souls. Eva found the director's office at the end of a long, carpeted hallway. The floral pattern of the rug was faded to a muddy brown, but here the sense of order was broken. The room had been tossed. Papers were strewn across the floor, drawers were pulled out, and a large metal filing cabinet was tipped onto its side, its empty drawers gaping open. It was the only room in the entire facility that showed any sign of violence or panic. Yet even here, the thick blanket of dust confirmed that the chaos was 40 years old. While Ben began the methodical process of photographing the disarray, Ava's attention was drawn to the heavy oak desk. Unlike everything else, one of its lower drawers was closed, and it had a small keyhole. It was locked. A minute with a Slim Jim from their kit, and the lock clicked open with a pathetic, metallic pop. Inside, nestled amongst mundane office supplies, was a single leather-bound ledger. It wasn't an official document. The cover was blank. Eva lifted it out, the old leather cracking slightly under her touch. She opened it on the desk, a plume of dusty air puffing out, carrying that same sweet, chemical scent she had noticed outside, but stronger now, more concentrated. The pages were filled with neat, spidery handwriting. It wasn't a log of medication or finances. It was a journal. The entries were dated, chronicling the daily life of the sanitarium, but the language was odd. The director, a Dr. Alistair Finch, wrote about his residents not as patients, but as a flock. He spoke of a great transition, a final graduation that they were all preparing for. His writing grew more and more esoteric as the dates approached October 1979. He wrote of cleansing the vessel and shedding the cocoon of worldly flesh. Ben came over, his own flashlight beam illuminating the page Ava was staring at. The final entry, dated October 31st, was short and scrawled with an unsteady hand, the ink bleeding into the paper. It read, "The harvest is tonight. The children are ready for their new homes. The nursery is finally full. We ascend, leaving the empty shells behind." Children? Ava's blood ran cold. The official roster listed only elderly patients. There were no children at Blackwood Pines. Her mind flashed back to the small handprint on the windowsill. It wasn't just a random detail. It was a piece of a puzzle she was only now beginning to comprehend. What did he mean by the nursery? Driven by a new, frantic energy, they moved out of the office, their search now having a desperate focus. They had to find this nursery. They checked every room, every closet, cross-referencing their positions with the building's original blueprints, which they had on a tablet. Nothing. Every door led to a bedroom, a bathroom, a supply closet filled with yellowed linens and boxes of soap. The layout was exactly as the plans depicted. It made no sense. Disappointment was beginning to curdle into frustration when Ava noticed something in the main linen storage room at the very back of the building. It was a large, heavy wooden wardrobe, a monstrous piece of furniture that seemed too ornate for a simple storage closet. It was pushed flush against the back wall, but as her light traced its edges, she saw it. The floral pattern of the wallpaper didn't quite match up behind it. There was a vertical seam, almost invisible in the dim light. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She gestured for Ben, her voice a dry whisper. Together they put their shoulders into the heavy wood. It protested, its legs groaning against the floorboards, scraping lines through 40 years of dust. Inch by agonizing inch, they pushed it aside. And there it was. Not a wall, but a door. It was completely incongruous with the rest of the building. It was made of heavy, cold-rolled steel, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a bomb shelter. There was no handle, no lock, only a small sliding peephole at eye level, currently closed. The air seeping from the thin crack at its base was frigid, carrying a sharp, metallic odor that stung the back of her throat, a scent like old, dried blood and ozone. Set into the center of the door was a small, tarnished brass plaque, polished by hands that were long since gone. On it, two words were engraved in elegant looping script, a title that was both innocent and deeply, profoundly terrifying. It read, "The Nursery." The two words, "The Nursery," hung in the cold air between them, a declaration of intent so chillingly out of place it felt like a physical blow. Ben reached out instinctively, his gloved fingers tracing the edge of the steel door as if to confirm it was real. He pushed, the muscles in his shoulder bunching, but the slab of metal didn't budge. It was seated in a heavy steel frame bolted directly into the building's concrete foundation. This door wasn't meant to keep people out. It was meant to contain something. Ava's gaze was fixed on the small, sliding peephole. It was a simple mechanism, a small plate of metal set in a track. Her mind screamed at her not to look, to wait for backup, for a tactical team, for daylight. But the silence of the sanitarium was a living thing, and the mystery of that door was its heart. Her hand, acting of its own accord, reached up. The metal of the slide was freezing cold, even through her leather glove. With a dry, grating screech that was obscenely loud in the stillness, she slid it open. Darkness. For a moment she saw nothing but a reflection of her own wide, terrified eye. Then, as her vision adjusted to the near-total blackness within, a shape began to resolve. The room beyond was faintly illuminated by a sliver of light from the hallway, catching the edge of a single object. It was a crib. Not a warm, wooden one, but a sterile metal cage, its bars thin and closely spaced. It was positioned directly in the center of the room, isolated, as if on display. There was something inside it, a bundle of cloth, but from this angle it was just a formless shape in the deep shadows. But it wasn't the crib that made her snatch her head back, a strangled gasp catching in her throat. It was the walls. In the fleeting glimpse, she saw that they were covered, from floor to ceiling, in drawings. Not the cheerful stick-figure art of children, but frantic, overlapping charcoal spirals, all circling a single recurring symbol that looked like a stylized eye, with a jagged tear falling from it. She slammed the peephole shut, the sound echoing the frantic beat of her own heart. She turned to Ben, her face pale in the beam of his flashlight. "We're not opening that," she said, her voice low and strained. "Not without a warrant and a breaching team. We seal the building. No one else enters until we come back with force." Ben nodded, his earlier excitement completely extinguished, replaced by a grim understanding. The retreat from Blackwood Pines was more unnerving than the entry. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak of the floorboards a footstep behind them. They sealed the main entrance with heavy-duty police tape, the bold yellow lines a flimsy, almost laughable barrier against the 40-year-old secret locked inside. The drive back to the precinct was a void of silence, the unspoken images from the peephole flickering in Ava's mind. The metal cage, the bundle within, the weeping eyes on the walls. Hours later, under the sterile hum of the precinct's fluorescent lights, the Blackwood Pines case had grown from a single, dusty file into an entire corner of the incident room. While they waited for the judge to sign the warrant, Eva immersed herself in Dr. Finch's leather-bound journal, searching for any clue, any hint, that would prepare her for what was behind that steel door. His prose grew more and more detached from reality. He stopped referring to the elderly residents by name, instead calling them the Shedders, or the Husks. He wrote, "The vessels must be prepared, but they are not the true flock. They are merely the guardians, the camouflaging canopy under which the true saplings grow. Their vital energies, their memories, their lingering emotional resonance will feed the fertile ground." Eva felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't caring for them. He was using them, like a human battery. Her eyes scanned the pages, catching phrases that made her skin crawl. The children of the eye require a silent frequency. They must not be contaminated by the noise of the old world. The nursery provides this silence, a sterile womb for a new consciousness. Then she found it. A diagram sketched on a page dated the week before the disappearance. It was the same symbol from the wall, the weeping eye. Beneath it, Finch had written a caption, "Our patron, the one who waits on the other side of the static, the one who gifted us the science of transference." Transference? Ben's voice cut through her concentration. He was holding a preliminary background report on Dr. Alistair Finch. There was no record of him attending any accredited medical school in North America or Europe. His doctorate was from the Promethean Institute for Psychical Sciences, an organization that had been dissolved in 1968 after its founder was investigated for conducting illegal psychological experiments on children. Finch wasn't a doctor. He was a fringe pseudoscientist, a parapsychologist with a history of preying on the vulnerable. The breaching team arrived at Blackwood Pines just as the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows through the trees. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The tactical officers, clad in heavy gear, looked like soldiers preparing for war. They set up a portable hydraulic press, its metal jaws designed to crack open safes. The process was brutally loud. The groan of stressed metal, the high-pitched squeal of the hydraulics, the sickening crunch as the door's locking bolts began to surrender. Finally, with a deafening bang that echoed through the entire building, the steel door buckled inward, torn from its frame. A wave of air washed out of the room, not the smell of decay, but a cold, antiseptic odor. The smell of a laboratory, the smell of ozone and rubbing alcohol. Flashlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the room in stark, overlapping beams. Eva's glimpse through the peephole hadn't done it justice. It was a nightmare of clinical precision. The room was circular, the walls padded with thick, sound-dampening gray material, the same material covered in those terrifying, swirling eye symbols. There wasn't just one metal crib. There were 12, arranged in a perfect circle in the center of the room. Each one was empty. The bundle of cloth Eva had seen was just a pile of discolored rags. Each crib was outfitted with leather restraints at the wrists and ankles, and a strange, helmet-like device connected by a thick bundle of wires to a complex console against the far wall. The console was dead, its screens dark, but it looked like some perverse fusion of an EEG machine and a ham radio. This wasn't a nursery. It was a machine. Ben moved cautiously along the wall, his light scanning the equipment, while Eva walked towards the circle of empty cribs. The sense of wrongness was overwhelming. This was a place of immense, systematic cruelty. But where were the victims? What had happened here? While the rest of the team secured the room, Ben let out a sharp, choked sound. He was standing in front of a small, recessed panel in the wall, one he'd noticed because the weeping eye pattern was broken around it. He'd pried it open. Inside wasn't wiring or machinery. It was a filing cabinet, a narrow column of slim metal drawers. He pulled one open. It was full of manila folders, each neatly labeled with a number. EMS Row 1, EMS Row 2, EMS Row 3. Eva walked over, her dread a cold, solid weight in her stomach. Ben handed her the first file, EMS Row 1. She opened it. Inside was not the record of an elderly patient. It was a birth certificate for a baby boy born in 1977. Clipped to it was a grainy photograph of a newborn and a newspaper clipping from a neighboring state, reporting an infant abduction from a hospital. The date of the abduction was 3 days after the baby's birth. Her hands trembling, she opened another, and another. Each one was the same: a birth certificate, a photo, and a corresponding report of a stolen baby from somewhere in the tri-state area between 1976 and 1979. There were 12 files in total, 12 stolen children. Her mind reeled, connecting the dots with dizzying speed. The small handprint, Finch's talk of saplings and a flock. The cribs. The harvest on Halloween night. This place hadn't been a nursing home that held the elderly. It had been an incubator, a human farm hiding in plain sight. And as she looked from the files in her hand to the 12 empty cage-like cribs, Ava was struck by a final, horrifying realization. They had found the records of the children, but they still hadn't answered the primary question of the entire case. Whatever happened here? Wherever they all went, where were the bodies? The silence that followed the discovery of the files was heavier than the steel door they had just breached. Each manila folder in Eva's hands was a ghost, the echo of a stolen life. 12 names, 12 birth certificates, 12 newspaper clippings that reported the initial frantic heartbreak of a family, a grief that had long since faded into the cold ink of a closed case. For the state, these children were statistics. For the families, they were wounds that had scarred over, but never truly healed. And here, in a hidden room buried for 40 years, was the proof that their stories hadn't ended. They had been funneled into this place, into this monstrous machine disguised as a nursery. The forensics team moved with a new, somber urgency, their professional detachment frayed at the edges. They weren't just cataloging evidence from a crime scene anymore. They were mapping the architecture of a nightmare. Back at the precinct, the incident room hummed with a desperate new energy. The original board with the photos of the 57 elderly residents and 12 staff members now had a grim new section. 12 grainy black and white photos of newborns, pinned under the heading, The Nursery. The case had split into two parallel, terrifying investigations. What happened to the adults who vanished? And, more importantly, what became of the children? Ben spent hours on the phone, cross-referencing the birth certificates with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The results were dishearteningly uniform. Each child was still listed as an unsolved abduction, their cases gathering digital dust in a federal archive. With no bodies ever found, they had eventually been declared legally dead. Their parents were mostly deceased or untraceable, their trails gone cold after 4 decades. Ava, meanwhile, shut herself in her office, poring over the staff files from Blackwood Pines and Finch's journal, trying to find a connection, a single thread that tied the abductors to their victims. The staff records were suspiciously thin. Most were transient workers with no local family ties, their previous addresses leading to dead ends. They were ghosts, perfectly chosen for a conspiracy that required anonymity. It was in the 12th file, M12, that she found the first crack in the wall of silence. The child's name was Catherine Jenkins. The newspaper clipping about her abduction was from Oak Haven's own local paper. Unlike the others, this child had been stolen from their own town. A small, handwritten note was clipped to the inside of the folder, penned in Finch's spidery script. It read, "The final lamb. The mother is strong, a good vessel for the parting grief. Her resonance will be a powerful catalyst." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. He was writing about the mother's pain as if it were a fuel source. A quick search of public records gave them a hit. A Sarah Jenkins, Catherine's mother, still lived in Oak Haven, in the same small house she had lived in 40 years ago. Eva's hand hovered over the phone, the weight of the call pressing down on her. How do you call a woman after 4 decades to tell her that you've found not her daughter, but the place where she was taken? She decided against the phone. This was news that had to be delivered in person. The house was a modest, impeccably kept bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. Sarah Jenkins opened the door, a woman in her late 60s with eyes that held the same exhausted sorrow Eva had seen in countless victims. But hers was a grief that had been polished smooth by the passage of 40 years. She listened without interruption as Ava and Ben carefully explained what they had found, her hands resting calmly in her lap. The tears that came were quiet, a silent overflow rather than a storm. When Ava had finished, Sarah was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice raspy. "I knew she wasn't dead," she said. Everyone told me to move on, that she was gone, but a mother knows. I knew she was out there somewhere, waiting. She then provided them with the first tangible lead in the entire investigation. She spoke of the hospital, of the days after Catherine's birth. There was a nurse, she recalled, a young woman who had been exceptionally kind, staying with her after her shifts, talking to her for hours. Sarah had been weak, recovering from a difficult birth, and had been grateful for the attention. She remembered one small, distinct detail. The nurse had a tattoo on the inside of her right wrist, a small, simple design she'd never seen before. It was an eye, with a single teardrop falling from it. The weeping eye. The symbol from Finch's journal, the one plastered all over the walls of the hidden room. Ava showed Sarah a file containing the photos of the 12 vanished staff members from Blackwood Pines. Sarah's breath hitched. Her finger, trembling slightly, pointed to a young woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Her name was Mary Ann Croft. According to her file, her official role at the sanitarium was recreational therapist. In reality, she was a predator, a disciple sent to pluck a child from its mother's arms. The pieces were locking into place with terrifying clarity. The staff weren't just complicit. They were active participants in the abductions. They were the hands of Finch's cult, reaching out into the world. While Eva was with Sarah Jenkins, Ben received a call from the forensics lab. A tech-savvy specialist had been analyzing the schematics and salvaged components of the strange machine from the nursery. His report was chilling. The device, he explained, wasn't designed for simple observation. It was a two-way street. The helmets attached to the cribs were capable of reading and recording complex brain activity, specifically targeting memory and emotional centers. But they were also fitted with powerful electromagnetic transmitters. "It's crude," the tech said over the phone, "a brutalist piece of neuroengineering, but the theory is plausible in a horrifying way. It's designed to wipe a developing consciousness and overwrite it, like reformatting a hard drive and installing new software." Finch's transference wasn't a spiritual metaphor. It was a technical procedure. He wasn't just stealing children. He was trying to transform them into something else. Ava returned to the precinct. The image of Sarah Jenkins' quiet grief burned into her mind. She walked over to the board and stared at the smiling photo of Mary Ann Croft. She was no longer just a face in a 40-year-old mystery. She was a kidnapper, a key figure in a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of Blackwood Pines. The elderly residents, the husks, as Finch called them, were the cover. The staff were the acolytes. The children were the raw material. They had found the lab, they had identified the victims, and they now had a name for one of the perpetrators. But the central question remained, now more urgent than ever. The machine was designed to overwrite their minds. The journal spoke of a harvest and an ascension. Ava looked from the photo of Mary Ann Croft to the grainy picture of baby Catherine Jenkins, and a new, dreadful possibility began to form. They hadn't been killed. The transference had happened. The children, now adults, could be anywhere, walking around with new minds, new identities, completely unaware of the stolen lives they were living. The revelation that the children were not murdered but reprogrammed shifted the foundation of the case from one of mass murder to something far more insidious. The nursery wasn't a tomb, it was a factory, and its products were now 40-something-year-old men and women scattered across the country, carrying stolen souls inside their heads. The investigation splintered. One team was tasked with the impossible, trying to trace the financial and social footprints of the vanished staff and elderly residents, searching for any sign of life after October 31st, 1979. But Ava knew the heart of the case now beat in the hunt for a single person. Mary Ann Croft, the kindly nurse with the weeping eye tattoo. She was their only living link to the nursery, the only one who could tell them where the children went. The search for a woman who had disappeared 40 years ago was like trying to catch smoke with a net. Ben Carter threw himself into the digital abyss, running Croft's name and date of birth through every database he could access. The results were a flat line. Her Social Security number ceased activity in late 1979. Her driver's license expired and was never renewed. Her bank account was emptied and closed. On paper, Mary Ann Croft simply ceased to exist, a perfect vanishing act. It was as if the cult had meticulously scrubbed its members from the world before disappearing into the shadows. Ava, however, took a different approach. She believed the answer wasn't in what happened after 1979, but in what came before. She turned her focus back to the source. Dr. Alistair Finch and his Promethean Institute for Psychical Sciences. Finch's institute was a ghost itself, a fringe scientific entity that had dissolved under a cloud of scandal. But archives, even digital ones, have long memories. Ava spent days sifting through scanned academic journals, declassified government watch lists on cults, and crackpot newsletters from the 60s and 70s. She found Finch mentioned in the periphery of several parapsychology conferences, always peddling his theories on consciousness transference and mnesic imprinting. He believed that a human personality was nothing more than a complex data set of memories and emotional responses, and that it could be copied, wiped, and installed into a blank vessel, a child's mind. His work was dismissed as dangerous pseudoscience, but he had attracted followers. A list of attendees from a 1967 symposium in rural Virginia gave her a handful of names, other true believers in his twisted gospel. While Ben hit dead end after dead end trying to find Mary Ann Croft, Ava started running the names from Finch's inner circle. One of them, a Dr. Silas Weir, a disgraced neurobiologist, had a paper trail. He had founded a private, high-end children's educational retreat in Oregon in 1980 called the North Star Academy. It was exclusive, expensive, and catered to parents who wanted an alternative, holistic upbringing for their children. It closed in 1995, but its staff records were still accessible in the state archives. Ben, at Ava's direction, pulled the files. As the staff list scrolled down his monitor, he froze. There, listed as a child development counselor, was a woman named Anne Marie Cole. Her date of birth was identical to Mary Ann Croft's. Her hiring paperwork was dated February 1980, just 4 months after the Blackwood Pines disappearance. They had her. The discovery sent a jolt of electricity through the precinct. They now had a name and a potential 40-year history to follow. Anne Marie Cole had built a new life. She'd worked at the North Star Academy for 15 years, then moved on, becoming a respected, if reclusive, child psychologist. She had published papers on non-traditional learning and memory development, her work subtly echoing Finch's theories, but sanitized for academic consumption. She now lived in a quiet, affluent suburb a few states away. A recent DMV photo was pulled up on the screen. It was her, older, her hair gray, but the same kind eyes were there, a mask of benign professionalism. And as they zoomed in on the grainy photo, Ava could just make out a dark smudge on the inside of her right wrist, exactly where a tattoo would be. As Ben began coordinating with local law enforcement in that jurisdiction to place Anne Marie Cole under surveillance, Ava felt a nagging sense of incompletion. They knew how Finch had wiped the children's minds, but what had he replaced them with? The journal spoke of a new consciousness, a superior model. Was it just a blank slate, or something more specific? The thought sent her back to the sanitarium, back to Finch's office. The room had been picked clean by forensics, every loose paper bagged and tagged. But Ava had a hunch. Finch was a man of secrets and symbols. His whole operation was hidden behind layers of deception. She stood in the center of the dusty office, remembering the tipped-over filing cabinet, the ransacked drawers. The chaos had felt deliberate, a performance of panic. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for something out of place, something too orderly. Her gaze fell on the heavy oak desk. It had been thoroughly examined, but she ran her hands along its underside, feeling for anything unusual. Near the back, her fingers brushed against a small recessed brass button, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dark wood. She pressed it. There was a soft click, and a thin panel on the side of the desk, previously invisible, popped open. It wasn't a drawer. It was a hidden compartment. Inside, protected from the dust of 40 years, was another set of manila folders. But these were different. They weren't patient files. They were titled with descriptions, not names. The artist, the mathematician, the philosopher, the statesman. Eva pulled one out, labeled the musician, and opened it. It was a meticulously curated profile. It contained biographical data, psychological assessments, and even EEG readouts of a famous long-dead classical composer. There were excerpts of his letters, analyses of his personality traits, a complete catalog of his life's work. Every file was the same, each one a deep-dive personality profile of a historical genius. Finch wasn't just creating blank slates. He was attempting to imprint the personalities of dead geniuses onto stolen children. This was the science of transference. He wasn't just making new people. He was trying to resurrect his personal pantheon of idols. The horror of it settled over Eva like a physical weight. The 12 children weren't just missing. They had been used as vessels for Finch's monstrous, egotistical experiment. He had tried to create a master race of prodigies, built from the minds of the dead and the bodies of the stolen. She stared at the file in her hands, the profile of a man who had died 100 years ago. And she realized that Anne Marie Cole, the woman they were about to arrest, wasn't just a kidnapper and a cultist. She was the gatekeeper. She had not only helped steal the children but had likely spent years as Anne Marie Cole, the child psychologist, monitoring and shaping them, ensuring the imprints took hold. She held the key to finding all 12 of them. And as Eva stood in the silent office, she knew their next move was no longer just an arrest. It was a confrontation with the living architect of a 40-year-old crime against reality itself. The surveillance on Anne Marie Cole was a quiet, suffocating exercise in patience. For 2 days, Eva and a team of federal agents watched her from an unmarked van parked down the street from her immaculate suburban home. The house itself was an extension of the woman's fabricated identity. A 2-story colonial with pristine white siding, perfectly manicured hedges, and pots of cheerful yellow chrysanthemums on the porch. From their vantage point, they watched her live a life of serene, respectable solitude. They saw her retrieve her mail, her movements calm and economical. They saw her through the large bay window, sitting in an armchair, reading, a cup of tea steaming on the table beside her. It was a portrait of benign retirement, so utterly normal it was obscene. Eva watched the woman who had stolen a baby from its mother's arms, the woman who had overseen a laboratory of psychological torture, and felt a cold, professional fury solidify within her. This wasn't just a criminal. This was a monster hiding behind a masterpiece of camouflage. The decision was made to approach her quietly. A full SWAT entry would drive her deeper into silence. This required a scalpel, not a hammer. On the 3rd morning, Eva and Ben walked up the stone pathway to her front door, their footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the crisp autumn air. The chrysanthemums seemed to mock them with their vibrant color. Eva rang the doorbell. For a long moment there was only silence. Then the door opened, and Anne Marie Cole stood before them. She was exactly as her DMV photo had portrayed her, slender, with neatly styled silver hair, and intelligent, inquisitive eyes behind a pair of elegant glasses. She wore a simple cashmere sweater and gray slacks. She looked at them not with alarm but with a placid, analytical curiosity, as if they were unexpected clients. "Detective Eva Rostova, Oak Haven PD," Eva said, holding up her badge. "This is Detective Carter. We'd like to ask you a few questions about a case you may have been involved with in 1979. May we come in?" There was no flicker of fear in the woman's eyes, no tightening of her mouth. There was only a brief, almost imperceptible pause, a moment of calculation. Then she smiled, a thin, clinical smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth and cultured. "Please." She stepped aside, gesturing them into a house that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. The interior was as sterile and controlled as the exterior. The furniture was minimalist. The walls were white, adorned with abstract art. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a gallery or a waiting room. She led them to a small study, its walls lined with books: psychology, philosophy, art history, biographies of great thinkers. She gestured for them to sit in 2 chairs opposite her own heavy wooden desk, the same way she must have sat with hundreds of patients. She folded her hands on the desk, the picture of calm authority. "Now," she said, "how can I help you, detectives?" Eva didn't waste time with pleasantries. She placed a single photograph on the desk, sliding it across the polished wood. It was a picture of the nurse, Mary Ann Croft, from the Blackwood Pines staff file. Anne-Marie glanced at it, her expression unchanged. "I'm afraid I don't recognize this person. It was a long time ago." Eva slid another photo across the desk. This one was of the weeping eye symbol taken from the wall of the nursery. At this, a subtle shift occurred. A flicker of something, recognition, nostalgia, perhaps even pride, passed through her eyes before being suppressed. "An interesting design," she commented, her tone detached, "almost archetypal." "We found it on the walls of a hidden room," Eva said, her voice level and cold. "A room inside the Blackwood Pines Sanitarium. A room you called the nursery." She watched the woman's face, searching for a crack in the facade. There was none. Anne-Marie simply leaned back in her chair, a sigh of intellectual disappointment escaping her lips. "You found the workshop then," she said, as if they were uneducated students who had stumbled upon a complex scientific theorem. "I suppose it was inevitable. The term you're looking for, detective, is not crime. It's genesis." Ben, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "We found the files," he said, his voice tight with anger. "We know about the 12 children you abducted. We know about Catherine Jenkins." For the first time, the woman's composure wavered. The mention of a specific name seemed to pierce her academic detachment. Her gaze drifted for a second, a shadow of memory passing through her. "Ah, M12, she murmured, almost to herself. She had such potent maternal grief resonance, a magnificent catalyst for the initial energy transfer. She looked back at them, her eyes now gleaming with a fervent, unsettling light. "You call it abduction. We called it a rescue. We were liberating those minds from the lottery of random potential, from the dreary mediocrity of an unguided life. We gave them structure. We gave them greatness." Eva felt the room grow colder. She was not talking to a common criminal motivated by greed or malice. She was talking to a true believer, a zealot who had lived inside her delusion for 40 years. She decided to press on the creator of that delusion. And what about Dr. Finch? Where did he go? Did he ascend with the others? Anne-Marie's thin smile returned, but this time it was laced with condescension. Dr. Finch was the architect, the visionary. But the ascension you're imagining is crude. It was never about a physical departure. The bodies of the flock, the shedders, they were depleted batteries. Their purpose was served. Their residual life force, their memories, their emotions, they were the energy source that powered the final imprinting process. They fueled the transference. They weren't murdered, detective. They were consumed. It was a noble, willing sacrifice for the birth of a new generation of human consciousness. Eva stared at her, the clinical description of mass murder stealing the air from her lungs. She pushed the folder containing the profiles of the historical geniuses onto the desk. The musician, the artist, the statesman. Is this what you imprinted on them? The minds of dead men? You turned stolen children into plagiarized souls? For the first time, Anne-Marie looked genuinely angry, her professional mask finally cracking to reveal the zealot beneath. Plagiarized? She hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. No, perfected. We curated the greatest minds in history, distilling their genius, their essence, and gave it a new vessel, a clean slate, free from the noise and trauma of a normal life. Do you have any idea what we created? They are out there, living among you. A composer whose music stills the soul, an artist whose vision redefines beauty, a philosopher who will change the very course of human thought. They are magnificent, and they don't even know it. Their genius is so innate, so pure, they believe it is their own. A terrifying thought began to coalesce in Ava's mind. And what happens when they find out? What was Finch's final plan? Anne-Marie leaned forward, her eyes wide with a look of ecstatic prophecy. She seemed to swell with the power of the secret she had kept for so long. Finch was a genius, but he was also a showman. He didn't just want to create them, he wanted to unveil them. He built a final protocol into the transference, a subconscious trigger, a homing signal woven into the very fabric of their new personalities. She glanced at a large ornate calendar on her wall. It was a custom design, marked not with months, but with astrological signs and astronomical events. Her finger tapped on a date less than a week away. November 1st, All Souls' Day. The 41st anniversary of the Ascension. The trigger is a broadcast, she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, a specific sequence of tones and frequencies. A song of sorts. Dr. Finch called it the conductor's call. When it's broadcast, it will awaken them. Not to their old lives, those are gone forever, but to their true purpose. They will feel an uncontrollable urge to gather, to come together, to find each other. What happens then? Ben asked, his voice barely a whisper. Anne-Marie's smile became beatific, terrifying in its serenity. Then the final phase begins. The symphony performs. Their combined intellectual and psychic energy will create a resonance cascade, a broadcast of its own. It won't just elevate them, it will elevate everyone within its reach who is receptive. It will be the next leap in human evolution, a forced enlightenment orchestrated by the 12 greatest minds in history. Reborn. You can't stop it. The conductor is already raising his baton, and as Ava stared into the unwavering eyes of the cultist, she realized the case had taken its most horrific turn yet. They weren't just solving a 40-year-old crime. They were in a race to stop a psychological apocalypse. The drive back to the precinct with Anne-Marie Cole in custody was not a victory lap. It was a funeral procession for the world they had known just hours before. She sat in the back of the car, perfectly still and silent, her face illuminated by the passing streetlights. She wasn't a prisoner. She was an oracle who had delivered her prophecy and was now content to watch it unfold. In the sterile interrogation room, she offered nothing more. She simply smiled her thin, serene smile, her belief in Finch's plan as absolute and unshakable as a law of physics. The clock was no longer just a measure of their investigation. It was a countdown to a global awakening, and they had less than a week. The weight of it pressed down on Ava, a physical burden. How do you stop a song from being broadcast when you don't know the instrument, the orchestra, or the concert hall? Panic began to fester in the incident room. The case had ballooned beyond the scope of law enforcement, touching on neuroscience, metaphysics, and a type of domestic terrorism so esoteric it had no precedent. While Ben coordinated with federal agencies, attempting to create a profile of the 12, the potential artist, statesman, musician, Ava knew the search was futile. They were needles in a haystack the size of a continent. The answer, the key to stopping the broadcast, had to be with its creator. It had to be in the mind of Alistair Finch. She returned to the sanitarium one last time, the building now feeling less like a tomb and more like the empty chrysalis of the monster that had flown away. She stood again in his office, in the space where he had planned it all, trying to inhabit his narcissism, his obsession with showmanship. He wouldn't have left his magnum opus to chance. He would have left a signature. Her eyes fell again on the hidden compartment in the desk, on the meticulously curated files of the historical geniuses. She pulled out the musician file again, not to look at the profile of the long-dead composer, but to look for Finch himself. Tucked into the very back of the folder, behind the composer's letters and psychological analyses, was a single sheet of staff-lined paper. It was a musical composition, but the melody was discordant, jarring, made of notes that seemed to fight one another. It was a sequence of sounds designed not for pleasure, but for effect. At the top of the page, in Finch's own elegant script, was the title, Conductor's Call, a Mnesic Overture. This was it, the weapon itself. Ben's eyes widened as Eva laid it on the desk back at the precinct. A team of cryptographers and musicologists was brought in. The notes themselves, they confirmed, corresponded to specific electromagnetic frequencies, a sequence designed to resonate with human brainwaves. But it was the annotations scrawled in the margins that provided the final, crucial clue. They weren't musical directions like allegro or crescendo. They were numbers, celestial alignments, and atmospheric pressure readings. It was a complex equation that pointed not to a time, but to a specific set of atmospheric conditions needed for the broadcast to achieve maximum reach, a perfect storm of circumstance. And those conditions, according to the meteorologists they consulted, were forecast to converge in 4 days, on the night of November 1st. The final piece of the annotation was a set of geographic coordinates. They didn't point to the sanitarium. They pointed to the highest peak in the state, to a place that had been silent for decades, the old Oak Haven Weather Observatory and its powerful long-range broadcast tower. Finch's stage. The final night was a blur of motion against a backdrop of suffocating tension. A tactical team, Eva and Ben at its core, ascended the winding mountain road as a storm gathered overhead, the sky a bruised purple. The observatory loomed at the peak, a skeletal silhouette against the churning clouds, its massive radio dish aimed at the heavens like a listening ear. The air was electric, the wind howling a prelude to Finch's overture. They breached the main door and found not a soul. The facility was entirely automated. It was a ghost ship, humming with stolen power, its lights blinking in the gloom. In the central broadcast room, they found it. A massive, custom-built transmission rig wired directly into the observatory's main antenna. At its heart was a countdown timer, glowing a malevolent red. 0:01:23. On a vast bank of monitors surrounding the console, 12 video feeds flickered to life. They were live satellite and CCTV images, a god's-eye view of Finch's creations. Eva saw a woman in a Chicago loft, her brush hovering over a canvas, her face suddenly slack with confusion. She saw a man in a London boardroom, his hand freezing mid-gesture during a presentation. She saw a young politician on a stage in California, his confident smile faltering as his eyes glazed over. All 12 of them, scattered across the globe, were beginning to hear the call. The machine in front of Eva began to emit a low, guttural hum, the first notes of the broadcast taking physical form. The tactical leader shouted, asking for orders. They could destroy the console, but the feedback loop could be catastrophic, possibly killing the 12 people on the screens. Eva looked from the countdown timer, 00, 00 to 10, to the faces on the monitors. They were victims, their entire lives a fabrication, now about to be turned into weapons. Her eyes locked on the face of the woman in Chicago, the one she instinctively knew was M12, Katherine Jenkins, the artist. Sarah Jenkins's daughter. Her hand hovered over the emergency power cutoff, a single red button that could end it all. 003. The hum intensified, rising in pitch, a piercing, crystalline note that seemed to vibrate not in the air, but inside her own skull. 002. She saw the woman on the screen gasp, her eyes widening not in fear, but in sudden, terrifying comprehension. 001. Eva slammed her hand down, but she wasn't looking at the button. In the final, decisive second, her gaze had locked onto a different switch, one marked Manual Override, Localized Field. She didn't kill the broadcast, she contained it. The room fell silent. The countdown clock was dark, but the monitors remained on. The hum was gone from the air, but on the screens the effect was irreversible. The 12 individuals were no longer confused. A profound and unnerving stillness had settled over them. They stood motionless in their separate lives, but their focus was singular, turned inward. Then, one by one, their heads lifted. The woman in Chicago looked up, her eyes staring directly into the CCTV camera, as if she could see right through the lens, through the miles of wire and satellite relays, and into the observatory itself. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She was no longer Katherine Jenkins. She was no longer just the artist. She was awake. Across the world, 11 other pairs of eyes did the same. A silent, coordinated network of stolen souls, now conscious, their purpose finally revealed, looking out at a world they were built to change.